Salve Greece and Rome students, welcome back. Thank you for coming in to finish up chapter 13 with me today. We are moving quickly here through kind of the end of at least Western Roman history, and we're going to finish up chapter 13 today. Next week will be our last week, and we'll finish up chapter 14. That's a shorter chapter, should just take a few days. It's kind of through the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and then we'll practice, and then by the end of the week, we'll take our tests on chapters 13 and 14. So make sure you're reading along your book, keep it up, and come in and see me in my office hours if you have any questions or anything about the chapter that's not making sense. Last time I spoke to you and we did the notes, we learned about the rise of Theodosius. He was appointed as Augustus under the Emperor Gratian, because Gratian needed a huge hand with some of the military threats that were happening, and so he appointed Theodosius to kind of rule with him, because Theodosius was already a proven military commander, a proven someone who could win and lead, right? So Theodosius, he had kind of a rough start. The good part was that he made peace with the Goths who were threatening the empire. The bad part was that he basically had to let them stay intact and keep their own leadership, and that's going to have disastrous consequences later on, and we'll get to that in the next chapter. But today we'll talk about the reign of Theodosius and who might come after him, and then the last little bit about paganism and Christianity, what's happening with those during this time in the empire. Let me not cover up Theodosius here. He's a very important emperor. So for the time being, after he dealt with the Goths with that treaty, the external threats of the empire were mainly neutralized for the time being. If you remember, the Sasanians had their own kind of dynastic struggles going on, so they weren't, for the time being at least, giving the Romans too big of trouble. So Theodosius had to turn his attention to two usurpers trying to basically declare themselves emperor. To get some help, he appointed his son Arcadius as Augustus in 383. He'll have another son. That was his oldest son, Arcadius. The first usurper was called Magnus Maximus, and he was proclaimed emperor by his soldiers in Britain in 383. So Theodosius, you can't just let anyone declare themselves emperor, or it makes your power and authority look weak. So Magnus, shortly after being declared emperor, he moves towards Gaul. He crosses the English Channel, and he fights Gratian first. He defeats and kills Gratian, so this is how Gratian dies near what is now Paris. And so then Theodosius knows he has to take this seriously. Maximus marches towards Italy. The emperor in the west at the time was called Valentinian II. If you remember, he became emperor when he was 4 years old, so he had a lot of help. He was only 12 at the time that Magnus was marching towards him, and he had to basically flee eastward towards Theodosius to avoid being killed by Magnus Maximus. So Theodosius moves to meet Magnus Maximus, and he defeats him at the Battle of Pannonia, and he executes Magnus Maximus in 388, taking down one of the usurpers. And it is helpful here just to point out how it's frustrating looking back. At the time, of course, people were just thinking about doing what's right for them and what they think is the right thing. But looking back, it seems like madness that they're still having these internal struggles when the threats around them from other peoples and other empires are so great. With the Huns coming from the north, the Goths, you have the Sasanians over there. There's just all sorts of threats, and they're still fighting against each other and spoiling, resources, losing soldiers, things like that. So it seems like madness, but that's just human nature. Theodosius, after he defeats Magnus Maximus, he heads back to the east, and Valentinian stays in the west. Valentinian's still young at that time, a teenager, so he's left under the regency of a Frankish general called Arbogast. Franks and other tribes at this time, some of their leaders were, in the Roman military, and they were happy to kind of rise up the ranks and enjoy some of that Roman success, right? And we'll talk about Arbogast on the next slide. A regent, if you don't know that word, regency means Valentinian was too young to rule just completely alone, and so a regent means someone who will help you rule until you're of age to do it independently. So Valentinian II is left with Arbogast, but we don't know all the details here. But from what we can understand, Arbogast treats him harshly. It doesn't go well. He's not a good tutor or mentor, and Valentinian dies in some way, allegedly by committing suicide, because he's so unhappy at the treatment he's receiving. Some people think that maybe he was killed by Arbogast in some way, but young Valentinian does die. So he had kind of a rough, he didn't even make it into adulthood as an Emperor Valentinian II. Now, Arbogast wants to keep power, but as a Frankish general, he doesn't really have the standing to declare himself Augustus at this time. So he proclaims another official who was had the background and the Roman background to be emperor, Eugenius, and the idea was Arbogast could control him and pull some of the strings behind the scene. Theodosius, of course, does not recognize Eugenius. He recognized this as a usurper because it was not valid just appointing someone without consulting with Theodosius, and of course what happened with Valentinian II. So Theodosius has to head back and again fight another usurper, and he defeats Eugenius and Arbogast at the Battle of the River Frigidus in 394. So Theodosius very busy with basically internal struggles during this part of his reign. And Theodosius ends up dying in the next year, 395 January, in Milan. So his kind of a tough struggle. The book mentions that Theodosius was kind of the end of an era as far as emperors go, and after this, it's kind of sad. The last chapter we're about to get into, it's kind of a downward spiral for the western part of the empire. The eastern part of the empire is still going to be strong, and it's going to exist for another 1,000 years after this, right? But the Western Empire, the next 100 years, is not going to be pretty, and that's what we'll deal with in the next chapter. Basically, it's just kind of weakening and weakening, and you don't have really any good emperors after Theodosius. So Theodosius was the last emperor to kind of actively lead the troops and actively participate in military affairs. We also look at him as the last emperor to control both parts of the empire, to control the east and west, and to be kind of that unifying force. And we'll talk about what happens after Theodosius in the next chapter and the rest of Roman history through 476. Now, the last part of the chapter here is just talking about, some details about living and in the empire at this time, but not really advancing the history per se, just some kind of details here. One thing is kind of how power had shifted, especially during the reign of Constantine and later. The Senate in Constantinople, isn't that quite a word? Constantinopolitan Senate. If you remember, I told you in a previous chapter that Constantine had made a new Senate at Constantinople to rival the Roman Senate because that was his eastern capital. So that Senate had gotten more power and kind of wrestled some power away from the Roman Senate. That must have been tough on those old Roman senators who saw themselves as like the true power. And they had become more important under Constantine. By 359, under Constantine's son, Constantius II, the Senate in Constantinople had risen to around 2,000 members. That's pretty massive if you think about it. We talked about the Roman Senate getting up to 900 members or so, and that was getting big. So massive Senate. Of course, with Constantine kind of shifting the empire a bit towards Christianity, we talked about before when you were a Christian, before when Christianity was kind of persecuted and looked down upon. If you were a Christian, you were not going to be put in any positions of importance. You couldn't be a civic official or a military official. But now we're shifting to where military positions and civic positions beginning to be more dominated by Christians, just because Constantine had shifted things that way. And it was just, if you wanted to get ahead, you were a Christian rather than a pagan. So by the mid-4th century, the army had grown much bigger. We talked about before the army being measured in the 100s, 200,000s. By now, the army was very large. It had grown to around 600,000, which is a massive army for the ancient world. And the Romans didn't have that enough native population to serve in an army that big. So they relied heavily on barbarian recruits, right? That's one of the things we're going to see that's problematic over the next 100 years or so is these barbarian recruits, because are they always totally loyal to Rome? Not always. We'll see that. The Goths, we talked about what happened there. So we'll deal with that more in the next chapter. But some of the barbarian recruits were good for Rome, and some of them rose to important positions and commands. We talked about Arbogast just a minute ago, the Frankish general becoming basically the power behind the throne for a little bit to Eugenius. Now, another position of power during this point of Roman history is bishops, because the church now was kind of open and it was allowed to operate openly and kind of dealt with the government because, of course, Constantine allowed this. And so every major city in the empire had a bishop, a Christian bishop by the mid-4th century, and they became pretty powerful local leaders. The most famous bishop is still we know today, the Pope, he's still officially the Bishop of Rome. And those papal elections, some of them became very hotly contested. The Pope had a lot of power, not just spiritual power, but in the ancient world, he had power to talk to the emperor and to make things happen as well. So those elections were really, really hotly contested for the Pope and the Bishop of Rome back then. For example, in 366, there was a papal election, and there was riots after there was a dispute of the election, and people supporting this side and that side, and over 130 people were reported to have been killed. So it shows you how big of a deal these elections were to the people in Rome and around Rome. The bishops of Rome and other bishops too were afforded many privileges by the Christian emperors, which were all, most of the emperors after Constantine were Christians. We talked, of course, about the exception of Julian the Apostate. The bishops were not always just like a rubber stamp and did whatever the emperor said. Sometimes they pushed back because, again, they were supposed to be kind of spiritual advisors rather than just doing what the emperor said. I'm sure the emperor had some power over them. But, for example, we have the example of Bishop Ambrose, who was a bishop of Milan, very respected by the people, very powerful, and he punished the emperor, Theodosius. I don't want to tell you about the whole incident, but there was an incident where during war, Theodosius had killed 7,000 citizens in this town. That's another story you can look up. It's kind of an interesting one. But Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, basically told Theodosius, "You're not allowed to enter church and take communion until you do public penance and serve your penance for doing this." And he basically barred him from entering the church in Milan. And that's what you see here in the picture on the screen. Here's Ambrose kind of blocking Theodosius. So that story shows you that sometimes the bishops could stand up even to the emperor. So Ambrose always has a good, strong reputation for that. Now, what about paganism at this time? Because, of course, Christianity has been on the rise. You might think paganism, falls apart. It's important to remember about paganism that we think of paganism versus Christianity at this time. It wasn't quite like that. Christianity was mostly unified with some schisms and heretics sometimes, but paganism was not really unified. There was not like a pagan church and a pagan pope and pagan bishops. Paganism was very spread out. Pagans could refer to a completely different religion, a pagan religion up here in Britain versus this pagan religion over in Syria. So it was not one thing. They were not united. They did not really talk to each other and help each other. So that was one of the things that helped Christianity's rise, was they were more unified. They had church councils and priests and bishops and everything like that. Paganism was very decentralized, and it varied very much around the empire. Again, it looked very different in different provinces and places. To give us an idea of the shift from paganism to Christianity around 312, which was when the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, whenever Constantine defeated Maxentius. We think the pagans, it's hard to tell for sure, of course, but they estimate pagans probably 90% of the empire or more. Christianity hadn't grown that much, even in almost 300 years. Conversions probably picked up after Constantine. Constantine did not mandate conversion. There was not forced conversion or anything like that. But of course, if the emperor is heard to have converted Christianity and his family has, that's going to play a huge role, because the emperor is almost looked up to as this huge towering figure. So also, Christians were favored in official appointments under the reign of Constantine and his sons after that. So it's another thing, kind of practically, if you wanted to be in the government or a high-ranking military official, that would also be a reason to convert to Christianity at this time. And over time, pagans got, basically the roles were reversed, whereas Christians used to be disbarred from certain things. Now it's kind of flipping around, and Christians are favored and pagans are left out of some things. So we know by 415, pagans were debarred from holding a lot of administrative posts within the empire. Constantius II banned pagan sacrifices that had been, of course, taking place. We talked about before how Christians you were mandated to make the sacrifices and get some sort of little card called a libellus that said you did that. So, but now the pagan sacrifices are banned, and later emperors even permitted destruction and tearing down of pagan temples. Now, this doesn't mean paganism will disappear. Some people, they want to, keep their religion that their parents taught them, so they do not just evaporate. And paganism was practiced into the 5th century and was still popular with a lot of people. But again, it was more local and low profile, kind of like Christianity had been before. The roles have changed here. Some advantages Christianity had as far as why it was able to kind of spread and overtake paganism as a more dominant religion. They had a shared scripture, so everywhere in the empire you go, you had the Bible that they could all uh, use as kind of the basis of their religion, whereas the pagans' texts were much, much more spread out. They did not have one text they all looked at. Monotheism, of course, is just something more easy to see and easy to rally around. Rather, the pagans, there might be literally hundreds of gods all across the empire, and some areas might not respect this god, whereas over here they respect this god. The Christians all worship the same God, and they had a more coherent theology. They had the Bible, they had treatises written by priests and bishops, they had these councils we talked about where they wrote out creeds explaining what they believed, and so it was just easier to understand for a new convert. Here is exactly what the religion is. Um, Emperors also would use Christianity to extend Roman influence. So let's say you were kind of another kingdom or neighboring principality, and you wanted to get in good with the emperor or his officials. A lot of times, these local kings and rulers of other places would convert to Christianity to curry favor with the Romans. And so we have examples of that in the kingdom of Armenia, Georgia. Some of the Arab rulers, a lot of Goths and Germans, and others converted to Christianity after Constantine made it popular. So we've seen a really big shift in about 300 years from paganism. Again, it didn't happen overnight, but Christianity is slowly replacing paganism as the dominant religion of the day. And by the time of Theodosius, probably a majority of people were Christians rather than pagans. So it's kind of interesting to watch. We'll pick up more about that in the next chapter, and we're going to do that next week. We'll probably spend just a few days on chapter 14. It's not too long of a chapter. If you love the Romans, it's not the funnest chapter because you're going to see basically how the West withered away and died, and that's just how it has to be. So we'll deal with that next week, and then by the end of the week, we'll be getting ready for our final test of the entire year, which is going to be on chapters 13 and 14, okay? So you guys have an excellent weekend, and I'll check back in with you guys on Monday for chapter 14. Okay, walete.